The U.S.-Iran war, where things stand as of August 2026, a conflict now in its sixth month. What began as a military confrontation in late February 2026 has stretched into a grinding on-and-off war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, one that has moved between open combat and fragile diplomacy several times over the past few months. As of Tuesday, August 4, 2026, the war has entered what regional trackers are calling Phase 2, Day 21, with the front lines shifting from the battlefield to the negotiating table, even as the threat of renewed strikes hangs over every conversation. The core dispute remains the same one that triggered the war in the first place: Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile capabilities, and the broader question of Tehran's regional influence through allied armed groups. But the war has since widened to include a second economically vital front: control over the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a large share of the world's oil and gas exports pass.
The United States and Israel launched their offensive against Iran in late February 2026, framing it as a decisive strike against Iran's nuclear infrastructure and military command network. In the months that followed, U.S. and Israeli forces carried out repeated waves of airstrikes on Iranian territory, hitting missile and drone production facilities, air defense installations, IRGC command centers, and coastal surveillance sites. In one overnight operation at the end of July, the U.S. military struck targets across at least 5 Iranian provinces, describing them as IRGC command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities. Iran has not remained passive. Iranian officials have repeatedly promised retaliation for continued attacks, particularly any strikes aimed at the country's energy infrastructure. Iran's wartime military commander has accused Washington of accelerating toward a full-scale regional war, saying the U.S. is using regional neighbors' resources as a shield for its own interests, while reinforcing Israel's military capacity. Iranian state media has suggested the armed forces have drawn up an extensive retaliation plan in case of further American attacks.
The toll on the ground. The human and material cost has been steep on both sides. For the United States, casualties have been mounting steadily since the war's outbreak. Official Department of Defense tracking shows 18 U.S. troops killed and 687 wounded since the war began on February 28, with 4 of those deaths and 270 of the wounded occurring on or after July 7 alone, suggesting the pace of American casualties accelerated sharply in the war's more recent phase. Inside Iran, the toll includes both direct war casualties and a wave of internal repression. Strikes on Iranian provinces have killed soldiers and civilians, including young children caught in strikes on residential areas. Separately, Iran's government has intensified its crackdown on domestic dissent since the war began, executing protesters accused of waging war against God or violence against security forces. Human rights monitors have documented a string of such executions tied to the wartime crackdown, with judiciary officials reportedly ordering expedited trials for people accused of collaborating with the aggressor enemy. Iran's energy sector has absorbed serious damage too. Officials in Tehran have urged citizens to cut back on energy usage and warned of possible power outages after the country's natural gas production capacity dropped by roughly 230 million cubic meters a day since the war's start. The war's spillover has hit regional shipping as well. Houthi forces in Yemen, aligned with Iran, have threatened Saudi-linked shipping attempting to pass through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, prompting at least 6 Saudi-operated tankers to reroute entirely around Africa, adding roughly 2 weeks to their voyages. The diplomatic roller coaster. The war's recent weeks have been defined by whiplash: attacks threatened, then called off; talks announced, then denied; deals claimed, then disputed. In early August, President Trump announced he was canceling a new round of planned U.S. attacks on Iran, citing progress in back-channel negotiations, saying the decision came after Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself had appealed to him to hold off. Just days earlier, he had declared the U.S. military locked and loaded and ready to strike Iran with force not seen since World War II, before pivoting to say he'd agreed to cancel the attack in favor of a rapid deal, first on Hormuz, and afterward, he claimed, on the nuclear file.
Tehran tells a different story. Iranian officials have publicly denied that direct talks with Washington have resumed, even as Trump insisted negotiations were underway and productive. That contradiction spilled into public view when Trump branded the Iranian leadership unbelievably duplicitous after Tehran denied talks had restarted, even as his own aides described very good discussions taking place. Markets reacted quickly to the mood swings. Oil prices fell sharply on news that Trump had called off planned strikes, though prices have moved erratically along with the on-again, off-again negotiations. Trump has also accused oil companies of profiting excessively from the volatility the war itself has created. The Strait of Hormuz becomes the main event. By early August, the war's immediate flashpoint had shifted away from strikes on Iranian soil toward a narrower but arguably more consequential question: control of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz.
Iran confirmed it was continuing negotiations with Oman, the other country bordering the strait, over establishing safe inbound and outbound shipping routes while protecting both nations' sovereignty and security. Qatar has pushed for freedom of navigation through the strait and for regional consensus on any long-term arrangement, rather than a deal negotiated solely between Iran, Oman, and the U.S. Trump has framed the strait's reopening in stark terms, saying on Fox News it would reopen soon, or Iran would face a harsh new round of attacks, warning that if Tehran backed out of its commitments again, it would get hit really hard. He said his preference was a negotiated settlement rather than renewed strikes, while stressing an even harder response remained available if diplomacy collapsed again. A military under strain. One striking development, the toll the war has taken on America's own military stockpiles, which could shape how much longer sustained U.S. strikes are even feasible without resupply.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies noted that U.S. air defenses have performed well overall, but months of continuous combat have significantly depleted missile interceptor supplies. Patriot stockpiles have fallen below 1,000 units, and THAAD interceptors down to roughly 250. Other reporting, citing Pentagon familiar sources, puts the depletion even higher, describing U.S. forces as having burned through close to 80% of interceptors for one key missile defense system, with commanders warning overall munition stockpiles have reached dangerously low levels. The regional backdrop. The Iran war hasn't unfolded in isolation. It continues alongside Israel's ongoing operations in Gaza and Lebanon, with humanitarian conditions in Gaza worsening amid supply shortages, including the destruction of a warehouse holding crucial dialysis equipment recently delivered by UNICEF, cutting off supplies for more than 1,000 patients. Even as international mediators push for Israel to scale back strikes in Gaza, Israeli officials say they will continue responding to any threats against civilians and soldiers.
As of this week, the war sits in an uneasy holding pattern. Attacks are paused, not renewed. Talks are underway, though both sides can't even agree publicly on whether direct talks are happening. Oil markets react to headlines rather than settled outcomes. And beneath the diplomacy, both sides are absorbing real costs. American troops wounded and killed at an accelerating pace. Iranian civilians and soldiers killed in strikes. Dissidents executed in a widening internal crackdown. And a U.S. military reportedly working through missile defense stockpiles faster than they can be replenished. Trump has been explicit that the alternative to a deal isn't the status quo, but escalation. Strikes at a scale, in his words, not seen since World War II. Iran has been equally explicit that it sees continued American pressure on its energy infrastructure as a step toward full regional war. Whether the current Oman-mediated talks on Hormuz shipping produce a lasting arrangement, and whether that opens the door to a broader nuclear settlement, remains genuinely uncertain. For now, neither capital describes the war as over, only paused, while everyone waits to see if the next headline is about a deal or about the harsh new attack already threatened more than once. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over a region when a war stops without actually ending. That is where the U.S.-Iran conflict sits right now, in the first week of August 2026. Not resolved, not reignited, just paused, suspended somewhere between the last strike and the next one that hasn't happened yet. At the center of that pause is a negotiation that almost no one outside a handful of officials in Muscat, Tehran, and Washington fully understands. Iran and Oman are talking about the Strait of Hormuz, about how ships will move in and out of it, who guarantees their safety, and whose sovereignty gets protected in the process. It sounds technical. It is technical. But it is also, right now, the single thread the entire conflict is hanging from. If that thread holds, the logic goes, it could lead somewhere bigger, a broader settlement over Iran's nuclear program, the original spark of this war back in February. If it snaps, Washington has already said what comes next. Not a return to quiet, but an escalation not seen since World War II, in Trump's own words. That is the strange arithmetic of this moment. A shipping lane agreement between two mid-sized regional players has become, almost by accident, the hinge on which the possibility of nuclear diplomacy and the alternative of renewed bombing now swings. For the people actually living inside that pause, the distinction barely matters. Iranian families are being told to ration electricity because the country's gas production has been gutted by months of strikes.
American families are refreshing casualty trackers that now count 18 dead and nearly 700 wounded, with the pace of losses climbing rather than slowing. Oil traders are pricing in a deal one day and a bombing campaign the next, because nobody, not the traders, not the diplomats, arguably not even the principals themselves, actually knows which one is coming. What makes this moment different from earlier lulls in the war is what's happening quietly, away from the headlines. American missile defense stockpiles are running low. Patriot interceptors, Reuters and CSIS-linked reporting suggests, are down to less than 1,000. That is not a detail policymakers can ignore forever. A military that is burning through its own defenses faster than it can restock them has a shrinking window in which "we'll hit them really hard" remains a credible threat rather than a bluff. So the Oman talks matter for reasons beyond shipping lanes. They are, in effect, a test of whether diplomacy can move faster than exhaustion. Iranian economic exhaustion, American logistical exhaustion, and the exhaustion of a region that has now watched this war grind through 6 months without a clear ending in sight. Nobody knows which headline comes next. It could be a signed arrangement over Hormuz, followed by cautious talk of a nuclear framework. It could just as easily be a canceled meeting, a denial from Tehran, and a resumption of strikes at a scale neither side has yet used. The war's defining feature right now isn't violence or diplomacy. It's the uncertainty sitting directly between the two, refusing to resolve itself in either direction. And so the story, for now, ends where it always seems to end these days. Not with an answer, but with everyone still waiting to find out which one arrives first.